Hi, this is 851 case study response by Joel Addis. What are the facts in this situation? So, the principal's been finishing up his evaluations. Most of his teachers have been rated high, with the exception of Mrs. Stevens. When the principal has viewed her class and been in observing or walking by, he doesn't believe that she's engaged her students in classroom activities. And also, when he's outside of the room, they seem to be loud and moving around a lot, and when he moves into the room, they're quiet. The principal is viewing this as the students not respecting her or participating appropriately. On Thursday of a week, a post-observation conference was held with the teacher. The teacher was defensive and argumentative and not open to some general suggestions to involve her students more. Her responses were that they were participating when the principal wasn't in the room, and that the increased student involvement wouldn't correlate to student achievement. So at that point, the principal reflected on the conference, and he decided to do one more observation before finishing his evaluation. On Monday, he stopped by Mrs. Stevens' room and he observed no change. He left frustrated, and he did not provide any feedback because he could not find one positive thing he had seen. Later that Monday, he decided to recommend her contract not be renewed. When he completed her evaluation form, it ranked her below average in 3 areas and above average in 5. Specific comments stated she wasn't responsive to directions, she had great difficulty in motivating students, and had problems in class management. And then again, that recommendation was that her contract not be renewed. There was a note left in her mailbox asking to meet the next day, and when they met, Mrs. Stevens became angry at the evaluation. She said it wasn't reflective of her practice. The principal had no knowledge and had not been providing adequate supervision. And when she was leaving the room, she charged that the supervision in the school is what had failed, and she threatened to take the issue to court to fight what she viewed as an unfair evaluation. So, kind of gone through the events already. They happen during the end of the school year and then generally just take place beginning on a Thursday after an observation has occurred through a Tuesday afternoon. The parties involved in the building are Mrs. Stevens and the principal primarily. Mrs. Stevens is probably a third-year educator. She's intelligent. She has excellent background in her subject matter. She stated she doesn't feel comfortable with the principal in her room, and based on that and the interactions with him at the observation conferences, they probably don't have a good working relationship. And then I've already talked about what her evaluation looks like. The principal, he's responsible for supervision and evaluation of all of his teachers. He's had to hire a good-sized group of teachers recently, and I wondered why that was. It doesn't really go any farther into that, but I just thought that was an interesting point to make. He wants to supervise and provide some feedback to his teachers, but then he also wants to avoid a quote-unquote quote catastrophe of working with Mrs. Stevens for another year. Both of these people are frustrated. Mrs. Stevens believes the evaluation isn't adequate or valid, and she's not been provided supervision and support to grow. She does not believe the evaluation is enough to non-renew her contract. She's angry, and she has threatened to take the situation to court. The principal is frustrated, believes that the evaluation is valid and that supervision is adequate to promote her growth, and he believes her contract should not be renewed. The only other parties at this point are Mrs. Stevens' students, the families, and then also the superintendent. There's really not enough information to gather the superintendent's opinion right now, and the only points of information about students and families would be the information from the evaluation about Mrs. Stevens' relationship with them. So legal and ethical issues. No one's really been hurt. Possible harm could be to student learning, school culture, Mrs. Stevens' career, and the principal's effectiveness. In terms of laws, there's not really a Kansas law stating that you can't let go of a non-tenured educator at will. Derby board policy just states that terminations and non-renewals will happen in accordance with the law and the negotiated agreement. And then the negotiated agreement says that that non-tenured educator can be released when the board, it's not in the board's interest to employ them. No reason needs to be given. So Um, this situation doesn't require the law break laws or the contract, but I would argue that this is not an ethical termination based on that evaluation. So, in a single sentence, what is occurring? So, the evaluation cycles resulted in a contentious disagreement between a principal and Mrs. Stevens about the result of the evaluation and the appropriateness of supervision in the school. So, what do we know and what don't we know? With the people, we know we know the opinions for the principal and Mrs. Stevens. We know they're both frustrated, and we know the principal's gathered some subjective data from her classroom. We don't know the relationships between all of the different people in play. We don't know if Mrs. Stevens has shared her frustrations with other teachers and if those frustrations are shared. We don't know what objective data exists and if that was even part of her evaluation. We know that this is larger than a one-room schoolhouse based on the number of teachers, and we know it exists in a district that is comprised of multiple buildings. We don't know the culture of the building or professional learning, mentoring, or what feedback looks like. We know this evaluation form, and I copied this directly from the case study because I wanted to point out some inconsistencies. Mrs. Stevens is ranked with a below average personality, but average relationships with others. Below average professional interest and attitude, but average relationship with the administrator. Below average teaching ability, but average in discipline and relationships with students. So there are a lot of inconsistencies in this form. And I don't believe that based on the evaluation, the result should be a non-renewed teacher. So we know that this process is built on subjective data from the form. We know that observations are part of the process. We don't know what objective performance data is part of it. We don't know how multiple measures are weighed. So what are the priorities? Well, the loss of an educator, especially in this way, could damage the culture of the school. If the teacher sues the school district, it can result in a damaged reputation for all involved. And then finally, Mrs. Stevens does have strengths, and replacing her might result in a teacher in her spot that's not as good. And also, training new hires are expensive processes, and resources are scarce. Mrs. Stevens' stake in the outcome is, I think, obvious. It's her job and her reputation. The principal can lose his standing as the instructional leader in his building. And then also, honestly, if he gets taken to court and loses, the district could have grounds to terminate his job as well. So there are some things I wish I knew about this situation. I'd like to know what the past practices by the superintendent. And I wanted to know more about the building, professional learning, the school culture, and then also Mrs. Stevens' classroom, just with some objective data. But do I have enough information? And that answer is yes. I have enough information to identify options, evaluate them, and then develop a plan. So, what are the options? The first one is to recommend non-renewal for Mrs. Stevens. So just continue on as planned and accept whatever consequences may come. Option 2 is recommend her contract for renewal, but not address any of the concerns that you have. So just kind of keep on keeping on. Then option 3 would be to recommend her contract for renewal, but engage in some professional learning designed to build her capacity. So when we evaluate the pros and the cons of the option, the pros of option 1, the principal gets to avoid his catastrophe. The cons are that Mrs. Stevens loses her job. Replacement options may not be as strong. Time's been invested in developing her as an educator. And then also, it's the loss of an opportunity to engage in real conversations to coach and develop a teacher. And it could also damage school culture based on her relationships with staff. Option 2, the pros, you'd maintain an experienced teacher. Cons, again, loss of opportunity to engage in real conversations to coach and develop a teacher. But then also, if the principal loses authority with Mrs. Stevens and other staff members, that can really be damaging to school culture. So the final option is renewal, including professional learning. You get to maintain an experienced teacher, opportunities for both. to build their capacity. A more robust evaluation tool could be developed, and then an opportunity to engage in intentional supervision and evaluation practices. And the cons would be that the principal could open himself up to criticism from her, and then it could still damage that school culture. Even looking after reflecting and looking at those pros and cons, I am planning on building a plan of action around option 3. So, what is our plan of action? First, communicate and prepare. Initially, you need to communicate with Mrs. Stevens that her recommendation will be that her contract is renewed, and then set a time to meet with her again in a few days, and really just want to give her some time to cool down for emotions to recede. And then in the interim, the principal needs to review some objective student data to determine the student achievement in her room. And if it's not where it should be, he should have data and relevant resources ready to share. So if her students aren't scoring where they need to score, and he believes that they're not engaged, he needs to have the research and the resources ready to show the correlation there. With the superintendent, the principal needs to communicate with them about renewing her evaluation and contract, and then looking at ways just to incorporate objective data into the evaluation tool. And then with peers, the principal should communicate with them from across the district as fellow administrators, just to collaborate on what could be done. So then we look at correcting things. And we need to look at the evaluation tool first and the process. Pre-observation conferences to let the teacher know when the principal will be in the room, as well as what they're looking for, needs to be a part of that. Measures of student performance should be utilized as part of the academic score on the evaluation tool. And then either working with district administration to reform the tool or adapting practice to incorporate more rigor. And then finally, meet with Mrs. Stevens to talk about instructional goals in a way that lets let the principal know what she needs. What would she specifically like some more support in? And then during this time, the principal should make sure and share positives, and then maintain a neutral tone that's not emotionally charged. And then finally, going on to training. Once the instructional goals have been established, the principal can engage in professional learning with her in order to build her capacity. Flipped observations can be used to allow her a chance to review educators in other classrooms as they utilize strategies to teach her content area. A mentor could be assigned. And then finally, ongoing professional learning should be incorporated into the building schedule as appropriate to target her goals. In this way, the principal is supervising and evaluating to build her capacity. And then finally, he should follow up during the next evaluation cycle, adding those steps to the process, the pre-observation conferences, using objective measures of student achievement, providing immediate positive feedback, as well as actionable feedback in a timely way through a post-observation conference. And then by following these steps and normalizing them throughout his building, the principal can become an instructional leader in his building. He'll increase school culture by focusing on educator capacity and effectiveness.